Plato is, in fact, one of the people who really pioneered an understanding of music historically. He'll kind of come up a bit here and there. St. Thomas observes that musical instruments move the soul to pleasure or to delight. By the very nature of music, it causes a certain delight in us, and we're going to talk about that delight and how it has to be used and moderated and that type of thing. We see this especially today because the powers of amplification have resulted, and also the ability to replicate with purity certain sounds and things like that, which is, the technology has made that we're much more capable in that regard. The music can actually cause physiological changes in the body. They know this from various forms of research. By the power of the vibrations acting on the body, they know that it causes. For example, in Liechtenstein, in Schellenberg, Liechtenstein, it's one of my favorite countries, if you go there, there's this bell tower. The church is hideous on the inside, but this bell tower it comes down, and the bell sits at the top, and the tone of the bell has a specific wavelength. And that wavelength, the length of the tower, is the exact wavelength of the bell. When you stand next to the bell tower, when the bell is ringing, it causes a resonance in your body and literally gives you physical pleasure standing there. So it's one of those things that, our technological abilities along that line have made it something that music becomes because of its ability to cause us pleasure and our ability to affect the responses physiologically, it's become a very powerful medium. These vibrations can even cause pleasure independently of the auditory aspect of it. It doesn't matter what you hear, just the vibrations can cause a certain pleasure. St. Thomas observes that music enters into the imagination. So it's something that comes into our imagination, and from there it causes pleasure. And he says there's two kinds. The first is an appetitive pleasure, insofar as the music moves the sensitive appetites. Now, the sensitive appetites are those part of us that have emotions, like anger, sorrow, delight, joy, that type of thing. And so there's different kinds of music tend to affect our appetites differently. In fact, not all music is the same. Music is on a gradation between the lowest forms of music to the highest forms of music. And the music, how you judge where the music is not the pleasure it gives you as a particular individual. That is not the standard of judgment. What it is whether the music, by its nature, which faculty of the soul it tends to act upon. So, for example, there's certain kinds of music that give pleasure to what's called the concupiscible appetite. That's the one that has the physiological form of love, desire, sadness, that kind of thing. And also delight on an appetitive level. You eat that chocolate, you really like that. You kind of get that emotional rush, right? Eating it. Okay, that is part of what's called the concupiscible appetite. It comes from the Latin word cupidere, which means to desire, right? Okay, cupire, sorry. Okay, so that being the case, there's certain forms of music that play that, and we notice this, right? Because people will say, I'm in the mood for this, and then when they hear that form of music that gives them kind of amorous feelings, they kind of, they get the pleasure from it, right? Then the next faculty is what's called the irascible appetite. And that's the one that deals with things that are arduous. The concupiscible appetite deals with things that pertain to touch and are physically pleasurable, that type of thing. And then there's the ones the appetites that deal with things that are hard and difficult. And that's the irascible appetite. So that's why we have things like, just on a physiological level, hope. So even animals who have emotions, right? They have emotions as well. You take the little snack and you wave it in front of him, and he goes, his tail starts wagging. That's the emotion of hope, right? Hey, I'm going to get this little snack, right? Okay. But also then there's the anger, is the emotion and the irascible appetite. So there's certain music that appeal to that, like certain forms of acid rock or ones that have a real heavy beat, that kind of a thing. even Plato and Aristotle and all the saints who comment talk about how they know for a fact that there's certain kinds of music that will get the person worked up so that irascible appetite gets worked up in order to do certain things. And we see this all the time, There's certain music they'll play at a football game or things like that to get people wound up so that they want to, go out there and charge, so to speak. Then there's certain kinds of music that appeal to the will, right? And these are things that don't so much give us an emotional satisfaction, but they appeal to some kind of an appetite in us, because the will is sometimes called an appetite. It appeals to our will. So, for example, certain forms of folk music and things like that, and also certain kinds of classical music appeal more to the will than they actually do to anything else. But then there's certain kinds of music that appeal to the intellect. They give an intellectual pleasure in knowing and hearing the thing, right? So Gregorian chant, which is at the highest, because the highest musical instrument is the human voice. All the other, like for instance, the organ is actually a mimic of the human voice, which is why organ music is pretty high up there as well. But Gregorian chant is the highest because what it does is it actually moves the mind and heart to have union with God. It doesn't move the emotions and appetites. If you heard some guy listen to Gregorian chant, he's like, you'd start saying there's something morally wrong with this guy, right? Okay. So there's certain music appeal to different appetites. So some of the lower forms of rock music appeal to the concupiscible. Some of the things like country music appeals to the concupiscible and the irascible type as well. Acid rock and various other kinds of music appeal to the concupiscible. The folk music can be kind of appeal to those as well, but sometimes but lesser so, because it tends to be more historical and therefore a little more rightly ordered. Appeals to the will, and then some to the intellect. So classical music appeals to those particular things. They give pleasure to different faculties, right? So you have to look at that. This music, so it enters into the imagination. And so we even see this, that we can elicit certain emotional responses purely by the kind of music that is played. Or we can elicit even an intellectual response based upon the particular music that's played, because associations that people build up with relationship to certain music. So for instance, if you hear that bum, 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 and you hear that coming along, you're waiting for the shark to come up and bite you, right? Okay. So we can elicit certain, but in the music industry and in the movie industry, they've become extremely able to elicit these responses by the kinds of music that accompany the thing. In fact, if you could remove the music and just heard the dialogue in most movies, it would be pretty bland and pretty flat, probably. So we also know that in the military they use certain kinds of music, that type of thing. This artistic ability is a particularly strong psychological force when it accompanies the right kinds of images. So what this tells us is that music is not necessarily bad. It's how it's used and the kind of music and that type of thing. There was a Chinese writer who once said, "You let me listen to a culture's music and I can tell you about the spiritual state of that culture." So that's all you have to do, is just listen to the music and you can tell. Why? Because if people are morally degenerate, what are they going to do? They're going to follow their appetites more. Whereas if it's more appealing to the intellect and the will, then it's probably more likely that it's a more refined culture. Because music enters into the imagination, it can actually affect our judgment. You'll hear this. You'll tell people, "Why are you listening to that song? It's degenerating Christ," or it's rejecting that heaven exists. Imagine there's no heaven, But it's not that bad. I like it. Well, again, you're back to the problem. The standard can't be the pleasure it elicits. People will often say that a particular form of music is good because it gives them pleasure, even though it is morally degenerate. For example, have you guys heard of a guy named Kanye West? Is it Khan? Is that how it's pronounced? Khan? Okay. Well, that shows you how much I know about these people. Or I should say that shows you how much I've listened to them. Right. He actually has a video out of music. that is explicit Horus worship. Now, Horus was an Egyptian god. It's basically a form of paganism. It's demonic. It's diabolic. Let me tell you. I can tell you this from my own personal experience. When they say that all the gods of the Gentiles are demons, that line in Scripture is absolutely true. So what's happening is in the music culture, the paganism is starting to arise, right? It's becoming what? Well, that's the trajectory because of the fact that people are just following a hedonistic thing. So even though they might like the music that he plays, the fact is it portrays Horus worship. In fact, he walks around with this little icon of Horus, right? The Beatles songs, for example, you can imagine there's no heaven, that type of thing. Or others specifically reject Christian teaching. So there's in other words, the lyrics or the content of the songs can actually be morally degenerate. And we're not even talking about the form of music. We're just talking about lyrics and things of this sort. The other problem is, and this is the thing, when you get a certain pleasure out of something, the brain actually releases certain chemicals that basically make it easier for your brain to remember and to make associations. So if people are listening to a form of music that's preaching them bad things, even if they reject that, the brain makes the association with this, the pleasure that was experienced in that, and the pleasure affects our judgment when lessening how bad we think the thing is. This is why you'll hear people say, well, I listened to this music and I turned out okay, and I'm like, maybe you better go talk to your confessor again, All right. And this doesn't have anything to do with backward masking, which I'm sure you've heard of. Some of the backward masking, I'm like, I don't buy it. Others, it's pretty clear, right, that it's there. Whether the brain actually has the capacity to reverse it and to make the associations, the subconscious, I'm not convinced of. I think it's more of a case of the person is opening themselves up to more of kind of a diabolic influence of some sort, more than likely. Plus, there's all sorts of impurity and just moral filth in the music that's out there today, in the videos and in the lyrics. Take some of the videos that are being played on MTV today and rewind and go back 80 years ago and play them. Your average person on the street would say that's pornography. It's on that level. So the problem is, so what happens is the pleasure makes the person open or susceptible or not judge as badly the kind of thing they're listening to. This brings up a particular problem. It's a problem that's everywhere. It's even a massive problem in the church today. It's called the principle of the integral good. Or the technical name is the pseudo-Dionysian principle of the integral good. And it basically states that a good is from an integral cause, evil from any defect whatsoever. So what that basically means, if something is going to be good, it has to be good in its totality. Otherwise, the whole thing is rendered vicious or bad. For example, I might have a good intention, I might want to help people's poverty. But going and stealing from my neighbor doesn't justify in the act of giving this guy stolen goods. The stolen goods renders the act of giving that to that individual bad. This is why the ends don't justify the means, right? But this principle of the integral good has collapsed as a principle even in the church. Let me give you a classic example. Even when you just give this example, very often there are people who will later come up and argue with you. So I'm willing to put up with that. The church always said that the mystical body, that there's only one church. It's one, holy, apostolic, and Catholic. The holiness means that in all of its doctrines, in all of its teachings, and in all of its morals, because it's from God who causes it, He's incapable of causing something bad. And therefore, it has an integral cause. It's good in all of its aspects. If there's a single doctrine or moral that is not right or good or holy, in a particular person's religion, that religion is, or that person or that religion to which they ascribe to, is not part of the mystical body of Christ. That principle of the integral good is so severe. You even see it in some of the old doctrinal moral manuals. They say that a single heresy, St. Thomas says, a single heresy corrupts the virtue of faith. You don't even have faith anymore, properly speaking. He says you just have opinion at that stage. So this principle of the integral good has become pandemic everywhere. And now we're talking about partial being part, there's certain religions that are part, they have a participation, but not a full participation. What kind of nonsense is that? It's irrational. To deny this principle is irrational. To say that religions are part of this religion that Christ established when they reject it isn't even rational. Okay, so that being said, when you're talking about music and movies, the same principle applies. All it takes is one aspect of the movie or the music to be morally degenerate, and the music and movie is morally bad. That's it. For example, in movies there are two kinds of sins. There's ones that can be simulated. In other words, you can fake them. Like you can take the knife and it's got a little packet in there and you run into the guy and then it oozes out the blood and everyone's like, ooh, okay. That's a simulatable sin. You can fake killing somebody. But there are certain kinds of things you cannot fake. You cannot fake immodesty. You cannot fake blasphemy. You cannot fake vulgarity. These are things you cannot fake. They are simply what they are. And so all it takes is, so people ask me, well, how do you know if you should watch a movie? I call it a one strike and you're out. It's based on the principle of the integral good. If they blaspheme our Lord's name once, that's it. Don't watch the movie. I mean, that really reduces the number, right? Especially from Hollywood, because they're not capable of making these movies hardly anymore. But the same thing applies to music. If the lyrics are blasphemous, or if they're teaching people bad things, or if the form of music is designed to actually cause interior dissonance, to give the person physical pleasure, but to bring them down, it's a morally degenerate form of music. I don't care if it makes you feel good. That is not the principle. I don't care if you get entertained by this movie. That's not the principle. The principle of judgment is, does this thing contain something in it that is morally bad? If it is, you can't listen to it. Because why? When God created the physical order, He created it for His glory, right? To manifest His glory through the thing. Every time you turn the button on the TV knowing that is you're going to watch something where our Lord is going to be blasphemed, or even if it's not, even just on an objective level, or if you play music that you know is morally degenerate, introduced into God's creation is something that is offensive to Him and His glory is reduced, and you have to make reparation for that. So this is why you don't even listen to it. Now, there are times when sometimes you have to sit and listen to something or watch a movie to make a determination about whether it's going to be acceptable or not, but really you should be the type of individual who that's their responsibility. Today you can get on the internet and find out what's in everything without actually listening to it or watching it. So that's less required. So this is the problem of the integral good, right? Because of its ability to affect us psychologically, therefore, it can incline us towards it makes us feel certain ways, so we tend to act according to the way we feel, what our disposition is, and so music can either elicit in us actions that develop virtue or develop vice, one of the two. And so not all music is bad. Some of it actually is good for us. Listening to Gregorian chant is actually good for you, right? Because it helps you to lift your mind and heart to God, to develop the virtue of religion, one of which its act is called prayer. Because music causes pleasure, however, we can easily become attached to it, which can cause spiritual imperfections in us. Because music gives us pleasure, if one gives oneself over to it without restraint, it tends to take on a life of its own. It's called license. Anytime you give in to pleasure unrestrainedly, it just keeps growing. Now there's a reason for that. St. Thomas makes the observation that the body adjusts itself to the operations of the soul. Right? So it begins to accommodate itself to be able to stand greater and greater forms of pleasure. This is why people do it more and more and more and more, right? But if you started right off the bat in doing that, the body can't sustain it, and so the person, they don't like it, right? But the license regarding the pleasure of music leads to license in other areas of one's life. We see this all the time, right? In other words, if you're giving into the pleasure of that, then what's happening? You're getting your soul in the habit, you're getting your faculties in the habit of following what's pleasurable, not what's morally right. That's why you don't follow your emotions. This is why you don't follow how you feel. You have to follow what you know is right. But if you're constantly giving into the music or listening to it all the time, you're feeding that pleasure all the time, and it can bring you down morally. Makes you weak, basically. Parents will often find that a teenager who listens to music without restriction becomes difficult and unruly. Right? Well, of course, the kid's following his appetites. You're telling him to do something that's against his appetites, so he's going to rebel. Because what you're doing, he doesn't feel his appetites. This is why Plato thought that music had to be regulated by the state, because it was such a powerful psychological force. I'm not so sure that our state should be the one regulating it. But it does need regulation, even on a societal level, in order to make sure that it doesn't corrupt the morals of the citizenry. Because it gives pleasure, not regulating it can lead to intemperance, the vice of intemperance. In other words, listening to... so this is why people who listen to music all the time have a certain intemperance. This is also one of the reasons why people who listen to music repeatedly all the time start finding in other areas of the life the difficulty in restraining the feeding of that pleasure. So this is why sex, drugs, which give pleasure, and rock and roll all come of a piece, right? If you want to read a book that will absolutely blow your mind, it's called Turn Off Your Mind. And the subtitle is How the Age of Aquarius Begot Charles Manson. It was written by the drummer of Blondie. Now when you hear that, you're like, how would that be even worth reading? But I guarantee you, he shows how the drug culture and the music culture in the 40s and 50s led to Manson in the 60s. In fact, what he shows somewhat indirectly is unrestrained in those areas leads to Satanism, ultimately. Also, certain kinds of music can lead, so it leads to intemperance, but it can also lead to the vice of anger. You see this with kids who listen to hard rock all the time. You know, they get unruly and they're just angry all the time. The pleasures of music, because it gives us a certain pleasure. Again, it's not bad if it's rightly ordered. It can actually calm people down, help them develop virtue, lift their mind, etc. But it can also, if they listen to it in an unregulated fashion, unmoderated way, it can lead to effeminacy. Our culture is so profoundly effeminate, it boggles the mind. And by effeminacy, St. Thomas defines effeminacy as a sorrow and an unwillingness to be separated from pleasure in order to pursue what is arduous and difficult. So in other words, it's the thing that keeps a person weak and mired down in the pleasure. That's what so a man who's effeminate is a guy who just won't do the tough thing, right? If males do not moderate the pleasures of music, they can become attached to it and they thereby become effeminate. If a guy has a problem with the sixth commandment, one of the first things you have to tell him is stop listening to the music. You know, and stop playing the video games because they give us a pleasure. Only use the computer when necessary. Stop watching TV. There's a philosopher by the name of Vogelin, Catholic philosopher, if I'm not mistaken. He said that technology gives us a pleasure in its use. So he said every time we use it, we should do some kind of mortification to kind of keep that at bay. And you see that really with technological devices, but it's particularly true in the relationship to music. Kids are listening to this music all the time. So you get one of the greatest ironies, hypocrisies, and contradictions is when you see some guy driving down the street in a low car, acting real tough, and his music is just blaring out of control. I'm tough. No, you're out of control, buddy. You're effeminate. Because you're listening to music, you're making yourself feel tough when you're not, and you're just, you know. In fact, you know how you can tell? Tell him to give up the girlfriend he's living with. And well, yeah, it's a sign you're feminine. If you're a man, you give it up. The wrong kind of music can corrupt virtues. We may say that music does not have the capacity to corrupt temperance and virtues, but also prudence. Because if you're going to pursue pleasure, you're not going to do what's right, since you're going to be imprudent. It corrupts the virtue of decorum. As we said, decorum is when your externals fit what's going on internally. But there's different kinds of externals, as we talked about. So in other words, what happens is with music is when people listen to it in an unregulated fashion, it corrupts their virtue of modesty and the virtue of decorum, right? First of all, if you're blaring the music so loud that your eardrums are hurting, there's already a lack of regulation. If you're listening to it too loudly, there's a lack of regulation. The music should just be loud just enough for you to receive the music and understand it, grasp its effect, etc. Not to be blowing it so loud that the guy next to you has to listen to his windows rattle, right? That's a sign of immodesty. It's a sign of lack of decorum. While the appetitive pleasure can cause these things, we have to also, this lack of virtue. It is also something which corrupts people's judgment about morality. Again, as I mentioned, because it gives you a certain pleasure, it affects people's judgment about whether something's truly bad or not. Yet, not all music is bad. Plato even says that music can be used to represent the masculine and the feminine. If the music is joined to the right kinds of imagery, it is possible for the music to directly contribute to the mental distinctions that people make about masculine and feminine character, but both as to what is unsuited to those characters and what is suited to them. For instance, if you see some guy walk in who's a little bit light in the loafers, and you hear the music, we all know what that means, right? Whereas if a woman walks in, she's got a butch haircut, and you hear this boom, 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 boom. She's a little heavy on the heels, we know what that means, right? There's some kind of dissonance there. Plato makes the observation in the Laws, it will further be necessary to make a rough general distinction between two types of songs, those suited for females and those suited for males. And so we shall have to provide both with the appropriate scales and rhythms. In other words, it has to be structured to fit masculine and feminine nature. Now, it is perfectly possible to make the necessary regulations for both kinds of songs in both respects, but natural distinction of gender, which should therefore be our basis for discrimination. Accordingly, we shall produce the majestic and whatever tends to valor, masculine. And what shall be the tradition of our law and our theory alike, that what makes rather for order and purity peculiar or particular to the feminine. So this is something which I think as women are listening to these impure songs more and more and more, it's leading them down a path of impurity. And with men, of course, they're listening to this stuff all the time and they're having problems with purity. Since masculinity and femininity are accentuated by the stressing of different traits, music can contribute to the forming of masculine and feminine character. It can lead to as I mentioned, it can lead to effeminacy. We see this in the case of men. If men are forced to embrace or listen to forms of music which are more active on the concupiscible appetite, that's the one that, gives delight and that type of thing, then the irascible appetite and the intellect, it will have a feminizing effect on them. You see this. The kids who listen to music all the time and play video games all the time, they get to be 30 years of age and they still haven't gotten a job, haven't finished college, don't know what to want to do with themselves. It's a mess. If the music was rightly ordered, if our culture was rightly ordered, by the time a man reaches 18 years of age, he should be mature enough to have a family. But we all know most guys who are 40 aren't even that mature yet. Not that they actually should, so they have to, because it's feminizing music. Not that they can never listen to these forms, but their listening must be moderated and directed intellectually so as not to effeminize them. Conversely, women who tend to the masculine forms of music too much take on characteristics proper only to men. You see this with girls who listen to acid rock. Something a little, they're not feminine. And again, not that they can't listen to this, but it has to be intellectually directed. Yet it should not be assumed that all music is unmanly, since it can form character and virtue. Music, which is part of the divine providential plan, is ordered towards the good of the soul and towards the rectitude and strength of the soul. So the criteria for good music cannot be based on the fact that causes pleasure, because that would be just hedonism, but rather it has to be based on two criteria. Its artistic merit. That is, some music is more beautiful than others, and some music is more capable of directing the appetitive life than others. The second is the moral character of the music itself. Those forms of music which tend to erode moral virtue, either because of their lyrics or because of the melody and musical quality, constitute a danger to people's souls and their psychological health. Those forms of music which tend to build moral virtue are good, insofar as their lyrics and musical style promote what is noble in man and in God's creation. So, for instance, the person who listens to classical music, it's ennobling intellectually. Music directs the soul, according to St. Thomas, and it draws one up to the heights. By this, St. Thomas means that it tends to lift the soul to the consideration of those things that are above him. In this respect, music can lift the soul away from the earthly things to heaven. It can incite devotion, especially in weak souls. It can incite man to follow God. And it can be used to make him even happier so that he advances towards his final end, which is God. Rightly ordered music can contribute to the building of the virtue of religion. It can also, the wrong kind of music can tear it down. This is what I made the observation about. There are certain kinds of music that have no business being played at Mass. On the other hand, we can say that music tends to can cause appetitive disorder, which causes that, detracts one from God, right? And results in the person, society being informed with that form of music, being drawn towards unhappiness, a lack of peace, strife, and disorder. Kids are always agitated and worked up. So I tell them, first thing, they'll have a hard time praying. First thing you got to do is get rid of the music. It's the first thing. Not because it's bad, but because you're overindulged and it's dragging your faculties every which direction. It's the problem. Again, this tells us there's a gamut of music. Or you tell them, quit listening to AC/DC and start listening to Gregorian chant. Of course, what will happen? If he's in the habit of getting an appetitive pleasure, the first time he listens to chant, he's going to have this kind of dissonance, like, I don't like this form of music. Well, no, of course not, because it's not giving you appetitive delights. Our soul yearns for peace. And peace, again, is this tranquility of order. If the music contributes to that order, that is, its virtue and holiness, then it can contribute to that peace. We see this. You listen to chant, it has almost a calming effect on the interior faculties and makes it more easy to meditate. You listen to other forms of music, and you can't even think clearly, right? And so that's peace. You're not going to have peace until you get cut out listening to the music all the time. And that means you also have to shut down all the things that are also involved in music. This means stop watching TV so much. Not that TV is evil, although a lot of the stuff on it is. It's like any other medium in and of itself. It's a good thing. It's how it's being used. You have to avoid those things that are just constantly bombarding you with things that are causing pleasure, because it's weakening your soul. Moreover, the tranquility implies a quiet. And so the use of music must be moderated in such a way that the appetites are not stimulated onto a life of their own. It must be moderated, since the peaceful soul desires interior as well as exterior quiet. Constant noise, or which we would call music today, is a sign of a moral and a spiritual problem. If you're constantly listening to these degenerate forms of music, it means you're neglecting your spiritual life. It means you have these imperfections at a minimum. And it probably means you struggle with mortal sin very often. I'm just saying these are not always, but very often. But it also can be this sign that you don't have your appetites under control. It means you're probably not the type of person who's very prayerful and quiet. The holier you become, the more the faculties interior begin to become quiet. Which means all that noise just gets to you after a while. Also, this tranquility means that it will be moderated according to time and place and kind of music. There's just, certain times and places for certain kinds of music. So what does this mean? It means, in a word, music properly moderated can contribute to learning, morals, and spiritual perfection. But if it's unmoderated, it can lead to moral ruin. So that's where it's at. So now that you have the principles, when you go to judging what's going on in the general culture, when you see what's coming out of Hollywood and what you see is coming out of the music industry, you begin to realize that these people are setting people on a path towards moral ruin. There's a piece of information I'm trying to track down. If someone knows about it and can put me onto it, I'd be much obliged. And so I preface this by saying, this gives you an idea of how bad it is. I was just out in California recently. I was talking to a priest out there, and he said, I asked him if he could get me the literature. He hasn't gotten it to me yet, but he said there's a new practice now in certain pockets of the music industry. What they do is they cut the album, and from what they call the gold, which is or something similar to that, or the platinum part of it, what they do, and that's not just the music thing they give to you, but as a gift because you sold 1 million or 1 billion or how many ever songs, but they created an original from that. Then what they do is, from that original, they go into a room, they perform a satanic ritual to get the demon to infest the original, so that when the copies are made from the original, the demons will be sent out and it will affect the people that are listening to it to increase business. The corporations are doing the same thing. This is why you have to bless your food. You can get that information right off the internet. They're getting involved in the occult because they find out it produces sales, right? That being said, this is one of the reasons why you have to severely moderate that type of thing. That's where it's headed. It's just heading toward overt paganism and Satanism. And that's not even to deal with people like the Motley Crue and all these people. It's not even that. It has to do with the fact that, it's just descending. And it's going to descend as long as our culture continues to pursue pleasure in the music as the sole end of the music, rather than the music being used to ennoble the soul, to enlighten the mind, that type of thing. Okay. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
I think it was it Father Karabi that's told that about the movie and the music industry and the curses that are put on?
Yeah, I've heard him say that. I'm looking for actual literature that can back it up. Yeah, because that's not the type of thing. If you're going to blast the people, you better make sure your ducks in a row, because if it's not, you'll be, made a fool of, really. Yes?
Going back to the gossips question, I have a question. In a certain situation, talking to your husband at home, what I like to call venting sometimes. I'm all day at my parents' house with different religions. I feel like I get bombarded with all kinds of stuff. I come home and I want to vent to him. I'm almost in tears about my mom did this, my mom said this. Is that a form of gossip that I'm not supposed to be doing? Or is it okay if it's just to my husband in the confines of home?
Do you remember the 3 things I said? Charitable, necessary, and just. Is it necessary? Venting is not necessary. In fact, if you read my book on psychology, one of the things I blast the modern psychologists is they say, well, you need to vent to get it out. No, what that does is by you doing it, it increases the habit and makes it worse. So what you have to do is, St. Thomas makes the observation, because you say you're upset, that type of thing. St. Thomas says all the emotions are moved by what's in the imagination. And he says all emotions are moved by by the emotion of love. Now there's also intellective love, or will, it's a part of the will. But he says it's moved by this imperative love. All the other emotions and appetites. St. John of the Cross calls that emotion of love attachment. If you can find the thing that you're attached to, is it that you want the approval or the comfort or the to be known as doing the right thing to those people? Is it human respect, or what is it that's getting you upset? If you can find out what that thing is and just let loose of it, you won't need to vent. In fact, you won't even want to vent because it won't affect you anymore. So it's a matter of the detachment. And if you don't know what it is, then this is a kind of a little thing I put people on to. It works great for me as far as finding other things out too. when Our Lady and St. Joseph brought our Lord to St. Simeon, he said to Our Lady, "Your soul shall be pierced so that the hearts of many will be laid bare." And what he was prophesying, in a legitimate sense, what he was prophesying, God was revealing through him that Our Lady is the one to go to, specifically under the title of the most sorrowful mother, to go, that is through her that hidden knowledge that you need to know, not just because you want to know what Mrs. Kerflufflewitz is doing next door, but you need to know she's the one to go to her to reveal it, specifically under that title. So what you can do is ask her, Our Lady, reveal to me what's hidden to me. Why do I react this way? What is it that's at the root of this thing? And she'll reveal it to you, and then you can work on that, and the other problems will evaporate, and you won't want to vent. Yeah.
But if you're not at that particular spiritual level,
Yes.
of not being to vent and be able to do that, if you weren't able to vent to your husband, who I think for most of us with really good judgment tells you you're full of emotions anyway, just calm down, let it go. Wouldn't you have that build up inside of you, and then you could go do something even more?
Yes, but there's a thing called resolution. Emotions have a certain trajectory and inclination, and psychologically, if we labor under a particular aspect that's causing that particular emotional life. For example, let me just back up a bit. When you're first married, how you view, St. Thomas says that how we view a thing, our emotional reaction is based upon the perspective that we take on the thing. So when people are first married, it's like, he's so wonderful, he's Mr. Right, right? Because and so that perspective on him, he just makes you feel so good, right? Then you're married to him for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and he can't do anything right. Right? So the perspective changes, right? And that determines your emotional state. What happens is if something happens that upsets us, then we need resolution on an emotional and a psychological level. What does that mean? It means that through truth, we have to see the thing as it truly is and in a different perspective, so that the emotions will begin calming down. If we don't see that, venting them gives you the pleasure, takes away the desire, and then you feel better. The problem is you've increased the appetite's pursuit of that object, so it becomes harder and harder and harder not to want to just vent, right?
But what if you know that if you're venting to your husband, that actually helps you to calm down, and he gives you...
That's just the fulfillment of the desire. Now,
that's not a good thing, then.
No. Now, that doesn't prohibit you from just going to him, look, I'm really upset right now, give me just a couple minutes to calm down, and go to him and you talk to him, look, this is what I see, what do you think? There's nothing wrong with that. But if let's just put it this way, anytime your emotions are moderated and out of control, that's the time to, because you're going to sin. It's just the nature of the beast. Once you kind of clear your head, now remember, the appetites are moved by the presence of their object. What does that mean? It means whatever comes into your imagination determines and moves the particular emotions that you have. So what do you got to do? Pass the mind, get my mind off it. Just get your mind off it. Once you kind of calm down, then you can think more clearly about it. You'll see it in its perspective, and then the resolution will occur, and then the build-up will be released by seeing it as it really is.
So, Father, you're saying the resolution is to go Our Lady, ask her to reveal it, and then you'll be more calm, and then you can talk about it?
Well, technically speaking, the resolution occurs when the appetites see the rational end for why you shouldn't react the way you react. So what you do is some people already know what their root problem is and just attached, or they even know the things they're attached to. So, basically the process of the resolution is first find the thing you're attached to, let it loose. Things will kind of calm down, and then you have to kind of try and look at the thing in a proper perspective. And once you are able to see it properly, then you won't have the same emotional reaction. And when it occurs again, you might have a bit of a reaction, but you can kind of rest on that. Okay, look, I just know that this, I just know my mom gets upset about these things. It's not personal. I'm not going to take it personally. I'm just going to, and I'm going to keep my focus on helping her do the right thing, do the right thing, that type of thing. Because what happens is, very often, is when people get upset or they want to vent, the first thing that goes out is the focus on what's best for everybody spiritually. You got to have a bit clearer of a head for that kind of a thing to happen. Yeah.
I just have a quick question. Wouldn't you think that attachment, if you narrowed it down, would be self-love? in Imitation of Christ, it talks about where true love ceases, or where self-love exists, true love ceases.
Right.
And true love, which we know is Christ,
Mhm.
the smaller we become ourselves, and
Right.
significantly we become, the greater God will grow.
That's absolutely correct. The thing is, to just to kind of give you a bit of clarity in that, all forms of, there's the self-love finds itself in different kinds of attachments, and those are the things you have to find. I mean, you can work on being detached from yourself, but that's more of a generic kind of a thing. You really have to find out what are the specific things I'm attached to and work on cutting yourself off from those, and then the self-attachment, the self-love will begin to wane. So, yes.
You were talking about how, you know, like if there's a movie that has blasphemy in it, then you should stop.
Right.
Where do you draw the line where, I mean, every story has to have like a contrast where, you know, like there's something motivating it, and often
Right.
good against evil.
Right.
And when you have evil, then you obviously have an actor who's going to act evilly.
Right.
So he's going to say bad words, and he might say blasphemy and stuff like that. How do you like appreciate the story, or should you just not? Should you just like quit?
Well, that's why I made the distinction between sins that are simulatable and those that aren't. You can portray someone as very evil without committing the sins that are non-simulatable. In other words, there's a way to portray people evil by showing how they take delight in mowing somebody down with an AK-47 or something, right? Okay. You can do that without the blasphemies having to occur and things like that. They used to do it all the time in the past when the decency laws were strapped onto Hollywood, but of course they wanted rid of those as quickly as possible. So there are ways to do it. You just have to, and they used to, you don't have to show the violation of the sixth commandment. You can just show the people walking into the room and okay, we know what's happening. You don't have to, show them the details. They don't need that, too much information, thank you. I mean, you just don't need that. Yeah.
What about the devices that can bleep out those parts of the blasphemous words?
Yeah, they're pretty good. I've when they came out with that, like ClearPlay, they're pretty good. They're pretty good. There's two sides of it. You have to make sure that you're not supporting the industry by buying the movie that contains it, even though it's getting cut out, because then you're supporting that side of it. The other thing is I've found with ClearPlay, they're pretty good, but if the blasphemy occurs in a foreign language, they don't get it. So you're like, well, blaspheming God, but because it's done by Protestants and they're trying to do the right thing, but it's it's still there.
And what about we've tried to have our children, when they hear anyone say our Lord's name in vain, to say a little reparation act.
Yeah, the divine praise. I usually tell people, like, blessed be God or blessed be Jesus Christ, true God's man, that type of thing.
I was going to ask, what would be the best thing to say?
Yeah.
As well as we watch movies, I think, all the time, analyzing them. And we'll often even stop in the middle and analyze what's going on, why are they...
Right.
So what you're saying, if one blasphemy would strike out?
Yeah. One strike and you're out, because the movie's bad.
It's kind of like something in the brownies, you just throw the whole thing out.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Which is kind of funny, because I don't know if you heard this, I'll just tell this very quickly. There's this guy who died, and because he was very young, they did an autopsy, and they found out that his wife was feeding him antifreeze in his green Jell-O. So the Jell-O might taste wonderfully, but you don't want to eat it. And then they found out later that one of her other husbands had died, and so they exhumed him, and sure enough, she had done it to him too. But anyway.
We're not getting married.
It seems to me that if you're saying one strike is out,
Yeah.
so ClearPlay and fast forwarding through the scenes that they're not allowed to watch and deleting the leaked words,
it's already been tainted. The movie as
Yeah.
a whole has already been disgraced. So
Right.
pretending that the words aren't there for the sake of younger children or even for yourself,
Mhm.
it just seems like it's either one or the other. You either throw the movie out or you can watch
Yeah.
it. So, I mean, is it tainted even
Yeah.
though you're pretending it's not there?
Yeah, I think because there was a Hollywood, or there was a group that was trying to take the movies and actually remove them out before it was burned to the media. If they would have done that, I think you can get away with it. But the problem is that they got sued, and so they couldn't do that. They had to leave it in there, but Clear Place said that, because the judge is there, said, well, people can regulate how they listen to anything, or watch it. Yeah.
They're still around.
Yeah, so you can still use those things. The problem is you're right. It's the matter of the principle of the integral good. That principle has collapsed so much. I'll give you another example of, some guy is living with his girlfriend. He brings the girlfriend to the parents' house, and they say, "Isn't she such a good person? She's really nice." No, she's not. She's living with her boyfriend. How is that good? And I think that that's the problem that we tend to take, is that and even in the church, as I mentioned, this religion is good, and yeah, but it's also evil because of the fact that it contains error and it leads people astray and it corrupts their virtue of faith, and etc. So this is what is being lost in that, and I think if you apply that to music and to movies, it's pretty brutal. I can tell you anecdotally that the people who, there's three kinds of people. They're like, Ripperger, you're off your rocker. Then you got the people who they follow it, and they experience a tremendous peace, and they don't have the same kind of agitations when they're watching the movies because they've weeded them all out, and they feel kind of relief that this stuff is out of their life. And then you got the people who, just listen to it anyway and just ignore everything I say. But in this particular case, I just don't see how the principle of the integral good isn't being violated when you're watching a movie that objectively offends our Lord, and you're responsible for that. And guys just like, well, see, you know what it is? We're back to the pleasure issue. People get such a delight and pleasure out of this. I just don't see it's that bad. Well, if your son or daughter held company that was constantly blaspheming the Lord, constantly inciting them to impurity, suggesting to them that they get involved in satanic worship, you'd say, you are not spending any time whatsoever with that kid whatsoever. Why then is it somehow distinct when it comes to music and to movies that do the exact same thing, and actually, quite frankly, in a much more insidious way and much more effective way? I think this is something that people have to kind of consider about that. Is this the kind of company that you want your kid to have? Yeah.
So, how do we implement this at home? I don't see any husbands here.
Well, that's the beauty. You just say, hey, you're the head of the household. It's your job.
But he didn't attend in here, but I say...
Well, he can listen to this song, or listen to this afterwards, so... But, yeah, I know it is. It's ultimately his responsibility, and a lot of times the guys just don't want to do it because they just want peace. Well, that itself can be a disorder, wanting peace at any cost. Yeah.
I was just wondering, how do you have this, how do you have this conversation about the integral good, basically?
Yeah.
You may have non-Catholic family members that are not interested in that idea.
Right.
Or, even Catholic family members that maybe aren't even in pursuit of virtue, so to speak. So, is there a logical explanation about why you should go with this? Or?
Yeah, usually I usually start with something that people can usually grasp. St. Thomas says that beauty is a species of the good. So, as a species of the good, something isn't beautiful unless it's integrally good. For example, you might have a woman whose face is perfect, but she's missing her nose. Not beautiful. Or symmetry, which is also, where the parts are mirrored, or there's a harmony. So what happens is, so she might be beautiful on this side of the face, but she's like, all right? Okay, she's not beautiful, right? It's the same thing with moral action. If there's any aspect of it that's not there, then the thing is bad. Just as the woman is ugly who's got some defect. And so, if there's anything lacking in that, then what happens is when you will the action, You will the defect, which means the defect takes on a formality in your own will. You become evil by willing this thing that's got the defect. And so that's why the principle of the inner good is so important. You can't will something that's evil, that has any aspect to it whatsoever that's evil.
There's a notion, it seems to me, in society, though, if part of it's good, then just grab what's good and leave the rest.
Yeah, the problem...
If it has a moral ending that's good, then it must be good.
Right. In fact, people will come to me and they say, the Pope kissed the Quran. I'm like, yeah, so? Okay. But the problem is that people look at that, some people are scandalized, and some people say, well, he's just venerating the good. The problem is his lips are sitting on stuff that's gravely offensive to God as well. Now, I'm not accusing him of anything on a subjective level. I have no idea. I'm just saying for you to reverence that. In fact, the church considered this principle so important that in the past you were forbidden, under pain of mortal sin, to swear in a court on a Protestant Bible, because parts were missing or parts were falsified. So the point being is that it's you're right. People tend to say, well, I'm just going to focus on the good. Yeah, the problem is you're sucking in the bad. Oh, I just love this green jelly. It tastes so good. Yeah, I'm also getting poisoned. It's the same thing. Or the brownies. And I think that's Father Wolf's example. It's the same thing. And I think that principle has collapsed. But I talk about this in my books on psychology, but when people start following pleasure and their emotions as a habitual state, then what happens is emotions want one thing and then they want another, and they're contradictory, and that destroys our ability to see first principles as binding intellectually. I do contradictory things. It seems okay to me, and because my appetites are being fulfilled, right? Rather than there's no intellectual consistency. When people start following their emotions, the first principles that govern the spiritual life and the intellectual life and the moral life collapse. And that's where we're at today. That's why you got people in the church saying that, you even hear people, stories of, Orthodox or Anglicans going to the Vatican and somebody in the Vatican saying, oh, you're fine, just stay where you're at. No, they're not fine. There is only one church. And that's it. And you have to be part of it to be saved. Now, that doesn't mean if you're, I don't want to get into that whole thing. But the point is that God as its cause is not capable of being the cause of first contradictory religions. The second of all, he's not capable of causing something that's false. As it says, he can neither deceive nor be deceived. That being the case, he's not capable of starting a religion that's false. And so if your religion contains something that is false, I'm sorry, it's not of God and it offends him. It's that simple. Yeah.
So back to this transition. What does this transition look like in our homes? We all can't just walk home today and say, get out the trash bag, bring music, movies, anything like that. So what does this transition look like? One, on a practical level with the physical species, but two, like you said, if you have a kid that's used to listening to all this music, or a husband that's used to listening to all this music, and then you put them in front of the Gregorian chant, they're going to go, I don't see it.
My experience is that, first of all, if your kids are young, you just don't let them in the stuff into the house to begin with.
Right.
But if it's already there, and especially if they're teenagers, this whole discussion of resolution, they're going to have to see the rational reason behind it, or their emotions are going to be all over the place, and you're just going to get somebody who's just out of control. And sometimes, so what I do is I tell people, well, have them read what I or Basil Cole or some of these other priests have written on it. The other thing is too is maybe have them listen to this talk so intellectually they grasp what's actually behind it. The other thing is too is if you tell kids this music is making you it's making you struggle morally. No, it's not. There's nothing wrong with it. The rebellion itself is a sign. The fact that they reject it, the fact that they can't part from it is already a sign of the attachment. It's a sign of the degeneracy or the imperfection.
How about weaning them?
Yeah, you may have to do that. You may just have to wean them. Obviously, if there's something that's gravely offensive to the Lord, you're going to have to chuck it.
Right.
But if it's something that's,
That's not the best.
yeah, you just have to slowly weed them. And I'm not saying you can't listen to, You know, there's certain kinds of folk songs that are fine. You know, country songs. Some of the older stuff seems to be less problematic. The newer stuff's just rock and roll masked. And then the Gregorian chant and the other kinds of music, you can get them. I mean, there's different kinds. You just have to get them introduced to them and get them to gain a certain appreciation of them. Yes.
I have a question going back to music, and like you talked about the different, like how can it appeal to certain appetites for the intellectual will. And I was curious, like when it comes to music in the liturgy,
Yeah.
like how, I mean, it seems obvious to me that, like for instance, music that appeals to the concupiscible appetite or
Right.
is not appropriate. But what about the will? I mean, obviously it seems like the intellect would be the best, but what about that? Where's the distinction between what kind of music is appropriate, and does that extend to instruments and percussion?
Yeah, the church always kind of regulated those things in the past. Its encouragement was always towards chant, right? It did allow some of the things that were more ennobling just on a natural level, but they said it couldn't be profane, and the tones shouldn't be profane. They should be directed in some manner towards the sacred in some way. So it's the sacrality, or the sacredness, is the trajectory of the music. So some of it, chant is by its nature just going to lead you much more to that than these other kinds, but these other kinds can lead you to it. There's certain kinds of instruments that are just going to agitate your interior life. So, for example, big bass drums or a trap set aren't going to help you spiritually. Other forms of music are. So, violins, the various stringed and wood instruments, and the brass instruments, some of them can, just depending on the thing. Some of them, too, can be used under certain circumstances. So, for example, if you're having the Feast of Christ the King and it's a procession, you can have, the brass to bring out the majestic and triumphal character of Christ's kingship, that type of thing. So some of those, and that can get you directed. But when you're talking about the liturgy itself, when you're talking about worship itself, it has to be fundamentally ordered towards what is sacred. Yes.
When you were talking about restitution earlier and how if we don't make it up on this earth, we're going to pay for it later.
Yeah.
And, in certain circumstances in your past, you can't go to past people that you have, said something rotten about.
Right.
Even if we're true.
Right.
Or maybe there's certain circumstances where, you had an opinion of someone at one point and said some mean things, but now you're actually really good friends with them.
Yes.
And to go to their face and tell them that, I don't know if it could destroy the relationship or not.
Right.
How can you make restitution?
By praying for them. In other words, you have to fulfill that transcendent order of justice. Yeah, there's certain times when you don't go to somebody and said, hey, I'm sorry I told everybody that you were just a, X, Y, and Z. Because it's going to destroy charity. On the other hand, you may have to go to other people. You said, hey, when I said that about so-and-so, don't listen to that. But even on that, you have to be careful. So it's a matter of prudence. What is the thing that's going to get them closer to God, or what's the thing that's going to fulfill the natural order of justice first? But if it can't be fulfilled, then you have to look for what's going to fulfill the transcendent order, and fulfill that at least.
How can you know, like, if you made up for that?
Well, I think the thing to do is having masses said for reparation of the past sins of you and your family members and things like that is good. Saying prayers, reparation should just be an integral part of your spiritual life anyway. You should be doing it on occasion anyway. And if you're doing that regularly, I don't think you have that much to worry about. Or another thing is ask the Holy Ghost or Our Lady to reveal to you what are the things I need to make reparation for. Yeah. Or your guardian angel, he knows too. Yeah.
You talked about transitioning with kids. What about transitioning with husbands? And if we just say to them, you're the head of the household, take care of this, then are we not accountable?
Well, you have to do your part, but he's ultimately the one who's responsible. Now, if he refuses to get some type of grave moral evil out of the family, then he forfeits the use of his authority in that particular case, and you have to do it yourself. But I think in this particular case, you're going to have to convince him, first of all, that it's a problem and it needs to be addressed. You can't just go and say, hey, you've got to get rid of this. You have to first convince him and talk to him about it, maybe have him read stuff or listen to stuff or what have you.
Well, Father Bonaparte was going to explain exactly how that's going to work if you're a doormat.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
Think about that.
So, yeah.
Father, you mentioned certain kinds of folk music are all right. What kind of folk music is that exactly?
Well, like Irish bagpipes, I think are great. And there's also there's each cultures very often have their own forms of music that grew up historically, and a lot of them are okay. You don't have to worry about them. So, yeah.
She was first, sorry.
Oh.
Could you please give us some titles of some books that might be helpful?
Well, Basil Cole has that one. Well, Turn Off Your Mind, I mentioned. Basil Cole has the one, Music and Morals, which is a little bit on the light side, but it gives a straightforward presentation. They've had, if you have access to the Homiletic and Pastoral Review, there's been, over the last 20 years, there's been several articles that were written that address this. A lot of times, if you just go onto the internet and type in, immoral music or something like that, you have to be careful. Make sure you got your web things, spam, or the filtering system properly done. But a lot of times you'll come up with, the Protestants are the ones that are pioneering this actually more than the Catholics. But even their stuff, you got to kind of wade through because sometimes it's a bit unreasonable. Not always, but in fact, sometimes they're the ones that are discovering stuff. You're like, whoa. So a lot of times, if you just look at that, there's also some videos on YouTube that are addressing the issue, and it's one of them they used to. Oh, what was that? There was several of them. If you just go on to YouTube and do that, you'll come up with like immorality in music or something like that. Very often they'll give you several, Protestant shows that have been put out that are actually quite good in that regard.
So,
yeah.
If you had a songbook that, and we're talking a big songbook,
yeah,
that had quite a few in there that just were not good for your kids to. I mean, even like a stupid song called, let's see, What Do You Do with the Drunken Sailor?
Well, I don't know. It's a Drunken Sailor band. No, just kidding.
There's a particular verse in there that
it's
supposedly referring to a nasty woman.
Yeah.
It could be inferred really bad.
You can just do post-production editing. You just
But if there's so many, would it not be like the movies? You just talk
yeah. Because you can reduce the book to being intricately good, right? By removing all the bad stuff.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, not that
Yeah.
Well, kind of along the same lines, if you have a CD and it's got 15 songs on it, and 3 of those songs got maybe some blasphemy in it or curse
Yeah.
words or whatever, immoral, can you listen to the other 12, or would you just say, there's
Well, here's the other thing. Let me just put it on this level. Let's say, for the sake of argument, on my recording device here, or your husband had a recording device, and someone said something about you that was really offensive, right? But he thought it was hilarious, right? And so he kept it, and every so often he'd press it to play just to get a laugh out of it, right? What is that? The very fact that he keeps the thing, that he owns it, that he holds it around, is going to be offensive. It's the same thing with God. Why is it that everybody thinks that, the things that we find offensive, that somehow God doesn't find offensive? It's like they kind of cut, oh, well, God, he doesn't care about these things. No, actually, he's more exacting than we are. So, yes. So to answer your question more directly, if you can't extricate them from the CD, yeah.
I'm trying to understand the principle of the integral good.
Right.
And the first thing that kind of came to mind was when you were talking about it, and you were talking about the Catholic Church in relation to it.
Right.
And it just kind of came to mind, well, what do you say about, we're all part of the mystical body of Christ.
Right.
And I know that Christ is head of the church, and that he's not going to let it fail, but at the same time, where do we fit in? Because we're fallen. And,
right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, as members of the church, as members of the church. That's actually one of the real bad things when they say we are church. No, we're not. First of all, it's grammatically daft. Second of all, we are not church. We are part of the church. The second thing is when we say the church is integrally good, we're talking about particular aspects of the church, not necessarily its members. We're talking about the fact that its doctrine is pure and always right, that its teachings are always correct, they're correct, that it sanctifies people. It does it in every generation. The integral aspects of the religion will never fail, so authority and hierarchy and those things will never cease to exist in the church, that kind of a thing. So that's what we're talking about. So, and you can't, when you're talking about movies though, you can't make those kinds of distinctions, because the mystic, you don't say, I am the mystical body of Christ. We say we are part of the mystical body of Christ, which means there's already a distinction that's being made. Whereas when you're talking about music and that type of thing, the blasphemies and that stuff are right in the music. They're part of the music. They are the music, really. And so you're talking about a different kind of a distinction. Sometimes it's a little hard to see, but I think that integral good question it's a real problem today. Huh? It's a real problem. I've been wanting to write an article about it, but I tell everybody I'm the opposite of Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner never had a thought that wasn't published. I got all these thoughts, but I don't have time to get them published. Yeah.
I was going to ask about Christian music, modern Christian music.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, a lot of it's very good, but there are songs that are theologically incorrect.
Right. So the same principle applies there. And also, if the type of music, because there's some of this Christian acid rock, sorry, that's just that stuff causes moral degeneracy. So you just have to, lyrics might be okay, but that's why the different aspects of the music, they all have to come together for it to form a form of music that's good.
So overall, I mean, is it a good experience for your kids? I mean, typically we listen to Christian music when we're in the car. The commercials are good, and so I mean, there could be something in everything that's not theologically correct. Is that, I mean, could you turn it off or?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously my kids are young, so they wouldn't think, oh, well, why did it say that?
The pronunciation as true of something that is in fact false offends God, which is different from, say, if I was to stand up here and say Protestants believe X, but we know that's not true, that's a different kind of a thing. Because one is asserting it as true and God becomes offended by that. The other one, God can be pleased with you talking about it because you can come to knowledge of it and reject it.
So if you're using it as discussion based,
right.
That's different.
Right. But here we're talking about the pronunciation of things that can be, of themselves, can be stated in such a way that they don't blaspheme. Using God's name in a blasphemous way, or certain words of vulgarity, you can't really use them without there being an offense in some fashion. So, yeah.
Not that I listen to rap, but what about Christian rap?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same principle as the Christian music. Is if the beat and that type of thing tends to drag the person down interiorly, if it tends to make the concupiscible appetite, stimulate it and give it pleasure, and makes it harder to keep it under control, then you don't want to listen to it. Yeah.
I think kind of you're just putting in a weird spiritual line, I think, which I appreciate.
Okay.
I was raised with classical music. My father always said, you don't have to like it, but I'll be darned if you're ignorant of it.
Right.
And I basically grew up with Wagner and a lot of his operas. And I
yes.
share some of that with my children, but listening to now, for instance, I don't know if you are with some of his operas, but there's a shore opera story, and one of them involves
right.
So because it's kind of a German fairy tale, to the extreme.
Right.
We understand that there is no God of love, things like that.
Yeah.
Is that not appropriate then for your children?
As I mentioned, it largely depends on the simulation of it. You can yeah, I mean, you can just talk about it. That doesn't necessarily make it bad. There's some kinds of things which are simulatable or which of their nature aren't bad in themselves, but in relationship to the particular individual, they can become a problem. So, for example, obviously if the kid is 3 or 4 years old, you're not going to sit there and tell them things that they're not prepared psychologically to handle. On the other hand, when they get older, you can have them listen to this music as, well, look, this is this kind of form of music. It has these difficulties. These are its aspects. So they can come to an intellectual understanding as long as what's contained in there is not some sin that can't be simulated.
Right, so even though the stories about gods, pagan gods.
Yeah, I mean, you can read about that. All you just have to do is make sure when the kids hear that, you just say, we know that this isn't true, but this is what people used to believe, and that type of thing. I mean, your kids should be knowledgeable about that, because if not, someone's going to come along and say, hey, there's this little God thing, and they're going to get sucked in, right? So, okay. Okay, if you kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et manet semper. Amen.